In this silence, there is a presence, not of ghosts, but of continuity, of something that refuses to die. Access to networks built over generations, to knowledge passed from father to son in locked rooms, to alliances forged in marriages that looked like love but functioned as treaties. Or are we players in a game whose rules were written long before we were born, by families whose names we know, and some we don't? The question is not whether powerful families exist. They do. The question is, how deep does their power run? How far back does it extend? And most unsettling of all, how much of human history has been guided by bloodlines that never truly broke. The textbooks present history as a series of dramatic ruptures. Rome falls to barbarians. The French Revolution beheads its aristocracy. Colonial empires crumble under independence movements. Each era, we are told, brings genuine change, a transfer of power from old elites to new forces. But when we examine the genealogies, when we trace the marriages and the money, a different pattern emerges. One of remarkable continuity disguised as change. Consider the simple mechanism of intermarriage. When two royal houses went to war, their conflict often ended not with annihilation, but with a wedding. The victor's son would marry the loser's daughter, binding the two lineages into one. Over generations, this created an increasingly interconnected web of European nobility, what historians call the cousinhood. By the 19th century, virtually every royal house in Europe descended from a handful of medieval dynasties. Queen Victoria's grandchildren sat on the thrones of England, Germany, Russia, Spain, Romania, Greece, and Norway. When World War I erupted, it was quite literally a family quarrel. Meanwhile, in the shadows of these visible dynasties, other families maintained their influence through different means. The great banking houses Fugger, Medici, Rothschild operated as power brokers, lending to monarchs and popes, financing wars, and trading expeditions. When kingdoms changed hands, these financial dynasties remained, because the new ruler needed their capital just as much as the old one had. They became indispensable and therefore immortal. The merchant families of Venice provide another model. For nearly 1,000 years, a few dozen families controlled the Venetian Republic through the Council of Ten and the Great Council. They traded in spices, silk, and slaves. They pioneered maritime insurance, double-entry bookkeeping, and the bill of exchange. When Venice's power waned, these families didn't vanish, they relocated. Their descendants appeared in Amsterdam, in London, in the trading companies that would colonize half the world. The mechanisms changed, but the operators remained remarkably similar. Even revolutions, those supposed great levelers, often ended with curious continuities. The French Revolution executed aristocrats, certainly, but many noble families survived by adopting revolutionary rhetoric, by strategic marriages to the bourgeoisie, by converting estates into businesses. Napoleon's empire created a new nobility, but many of its members were descendants of the old, who had simply sworn allegiance to the new order. The same pattern repeated in Russia, where Communist Party elites often came from the same educated classes as the czarist bureaucracy they replaced. This is not to say that nothing ever changes. Clearly, the world transforms, technology advances, social structures evolve. But perhaps these changes are more superficial than we assume. Perhaps beneath the churning surface of historical events, there flows a deeper current of continuity maintained by families who understand that power is not about titles, but about relationships, knowledge, and patient accumulation. The illusion of change serves these families well. Each revolution, each upheaval, allows them to shed compromised public faces while maintaining their essential networks. They emerge in new forms, with new names sometimes, but with their core advantages intact: inherited wealth, insider knowledge, and most crucially, connections to others of their kind. As we move deeper into this investigation, we must learn to see past the theatrical changes that dominate historical narratives. We must ask, who truly benefited from each transformation? Who emerged from chaos with their power enhanced rather than diminished? And most importantly, whose names keep appearing, century after century, in positions of influence? The sun rises over the Nile, as it has for 50,000 dawns, casting long shadows across temples that have stood for millennia. Here, in the land where history itself was invented, where the written word first allowed humans to project their will across generations, a particular form of power crystallized, the hereditary priesthood. Mainstream Egyptology focuses on the pharaohs, the god-kings whose monuments still dominate the desert. But the pharaohs, for all their divine status, came and went. Dynasties rose and fell. Foreign conquerors, Hyksos, Nubians, Persians, Greeks, Romans repeatedly seized the throne. Yet through all these upheavals, one institution maintained remarkable continuity: the priesthood. The priests of Amun at Karnak, the priests of Ptah at Memphis, the ritual specialists of Heliopolis, these were hereditary positions, passed from father to son for centuries. These families controlled not just religious rites, but vast temple economies. They owned land, collected tithes, managed granaries and workshops. They were literate in a largely illiterate society, masters of astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. They advised pharaohs and, when necessary, made and unmade them. During the New Kingdom, the high priests of Amun grew so powerful they effectively ruled southern Egypt independently. When pharaonic power weakened, priestly families stepped into the vacuum. The 21st dynasty saw priest kings openly taking the throne, but this was merely an acknowledgement of power they had long wielded from behind the scenes. Consider the alternative hypothesis. What if the visible pharaohs were always, to some extent, puppets or partners of these priestly lineages? What if the real continuity of Egyptian civilization lay not in the royal succession, but in these families of ritual specialists and economic managers? When Alexander conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, he didn't dismantle this system, he co-opted it. The Ptolemaic dynasty that followed presented itself as traditional pharaohs, performing the ancient rituals, even as Greek became the language of administration. Who taught them these rituals? Who managed the temples? The same hereditary priestly families, now serving new masters while maintaining their essential functions. Even after Rome absorbed Egypt, even after Christianity spread, the old knowledge systems didn't entirely vanish. They transmuted. Some priestly families likely converted, bringing their administrative skills into the new Christian ecclesiastical structures. Others may have preserved their traditions in Hermetic schools and mystery cults that flourished in Alexandria and beyond. The medieval church, like the Egyptian temples, owned vast lands and collected tithes. Is this mere convergence, different societies developing similar solutions, or could there be a more direct transmission? The visible rulers, certainly, but the scribes, the accountants, the ritual specialists, those who made civilization function at the operational level, they are too valuable to lose. Long before Rome, before Athens, before even Egypt's pyramids, the cities of Mesopotamia rose from the floodplains between two rivers. Here in Sumer, history's first urban civilization developed writing, mathematics, astronomy, law codes, and kingship. Here too, according to their own records, power had divine origins. The Sumerian king list, inscribed on clay tablets, presents an astonishing claim. When kingship descended from heaven, kingship was an eridu. The earliest kings, it states, ruled for impossible lengths tens of thousands of years. Only after a great flood did reign lengths become humanly plausible. Mainstream scholarship dismisses these enormous numbers as mythological, perhaps representing dynasties rather than individuals. But what if the Sumerians were recording something else? Not literal individual longevity, but dynastic continuity, the sense that certain families ruled so long they seemed immortal. The Sumerian pantheon was organized like a royal court, with gods assigned specific domains and cities. Enlil, lord of heaven and earth, and Enki, god of wisdom and fresh waters, stood at the apex. Their conflict and cooperation formed a central mythological drama. Intriguingly, earthly rulers often claimed descent from these gods, particularly Enki's line, which was associated with kingship, wisdom, and secret knowledge. The priest kings of Mesopotamia, Ensi, and Lugal weren't just political rulers. They were ritual specialists who maintained cosmic order through seasonal ceremonies. They controlled temple complexes that functioned as economic powerhouses, managing irrigation, grain storage, and long-distance trade. As in Egypt, these religious economic institutions provided remarkable continuity across political changes. When the Akkadian Empire conquered Sumer around 2334 BCE, Sargon the Great didn't eliminate the existing power structures. He legitimized himself by adopting Sumerian religious titles and marrying his daughter to the high priest of Ur. The pattern repeated through subsequent empires. Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks each adopted or adapted Mesopotamian religious structures and often intermarried with existing elite families. The cuneiform tablets reveal something remarkable. Certain family names appear in temple records across centuries, sometimes millennia. Scribal families, in particular, formed hereditary guilds. The ability to read and write cuneiform required years of training, creating a natural monopoly. These families controlled not just literacy, but the entire legal and commercial system that depended on written contracts. Alternative theories propose something more provocative. What if the ancient royal bloodlines of Mesopotamia deliberately preserved themselves through selective breeding, secret knowledge transmission, and strategic positioning in priestly hierarchies? What if the descent from the gods wasn't metaphor, but code for a genetic lineage these families considered special? Certain seal cylinders, those small carved stones used to authorize documents, passed through generations of elite families. Modern analysis shows some seals were used for centuries, suggesting extraordinary family continuity. The symbols on these seals often invoke specific divine patrons, implying each family had special relationships with particular gods' relationships that persisted across generations. When Babylon fell to Persia in 539 BCE, many elite families relocated. Some went to Persia itself, bringing administrative expertise that helped manage the vast new empire. Others moved westward into Phoenician cities and eventually the Mediterranean world. The Jews deported to Babylon absorbed Mesopotamian astronomy, cosmology, and legal concepts before returning to Jerusalem. Could elite Babylonian families have dispersed similarly, their descendants becoming part of various Mediterranean civilizations? Fast forward to the medieval period. Arabic scholars preserved and translated Mesopotamian astronomical texts. Medieval European scholars, in turn, learned from Arabic sources. Some occult traditions claimed lineages of secret knowledge going back to Babylonian magi. Are these mere fantasy, or could fragments of genuine ancient knowledge and the families that preserved them have survived? The controversial hypothesis: certain families today, particularly in banking, astronomy, and institutional religion, may descend from those ancient Mesopotamian priest kings who understood that true power lies not in military conquest, but in controlling civilization's infrastructure, its writing, its contracts, its understanding of time and cosmos. As stars appear over the ruins of Babylon, the same stars Sumerian astronomers charted 5,000 years ago, we re-left with an unsettling thought. What if those astronomers' descendants are still watching those stars, still recording, still remembering, and still holding power? The power passed to the House of Lorraine, and history textbooks closed the chapter on the Medici. Follow just one thread. A Medici cousin married into the Habsburg line. That Habsburg branch later intermarried with the House of Lorraine, the very family that inherited Tuscany. 2 generations later, those descendants held positions in the Austro-Hungarian diplomatic corps. Many adapted, joining the Austrian administration or relocating to Milan, London, or the Americas. The lesson: political titles are temporary. True wealth and connection persist. A family that plans in centuries doesn't need to hold the same office continuously. It needs networks, diversified assets, and the patience to let others occupy the spotlight while it maintains influence through quieter channels, banking relationships, marriage alliances, shared education, and exclusive institutions. In the candlelit chambers of power, there is a memory, not of empire, but of family, not of conquest, but of continuity. The names may fade from headlines, but they remain on foundation boards, in university donor lists, in the ownership structures of banks and corporations. The blood remembers, and power, it seems, is patient. In the forests of ancient Gaul, where Roman order gave way to Germanic kingdoms, a dynasty emerged that would later fascinate historians, mystics, and conspiracy theorists alike, the Merovingians. The mainstream historical account is straightforward. The Merovingian dynasty ruled the Franks from roughly 450 to 751 CE. Their founder, Merovic, gave his name to the line. His grandson, Clovis I, united the Frankish tribes and converted to Catholic Christianity, making the Merovingians the church's favored Germanic dynasty. But over generations, the Merovingian kings became weak, dominated by their own palace mayors, the Carolingians. Eventually, Childeric III, the last Merovingian king, was deposed and sent to a monastery. The Carolingian Pepin the Short took the throne, and his son Charlemagne would forge a new empire. End of story? Or is it? Alternative historians point to peculiar aspects of Merovingian legend that distinguish them from other Germanic dynasties. Chronicles describe them as having supernatural powers, the ability to heal through touch, clairvoyance, extended lifespans. They wore their hair long as a symbol of power. Cutting it was tantamount to removing their royal authority. Their symbol was the bee, not the fleur-de-lis that later Frankish dynasties adopted. Some sources claim they practiced forms of esoteric Christianity, influenced by Eastern mystery traditions. Most intriguingly, later medieval legends suggested the Merovingians descended not just from Germanic chieftains, but from a more exotic lineage, some accounts hinting at connections to Mediterranean civilizations. Even Roman imperial blood through the claim that Merovic's mother had been visited by a sea creature, producing a hybrid bloodline. When the Carolingians deposed the last Merovingian king, the official narrative says the line ended. But did it? Medieval genealogies are complex and often contradictory, but several noble families across Europe later claimed Merovingian descent. Some of these claims appear in monastery records, suggesting that exiled Merovingians and their children found refuge in monastic institutions where they could survive, but not threaten Carolingian power. Here's where history blurs into mystery. What if the Merovingian bloodline deliberately went underground, maintaining itself through marriages into other noble houses, through monastic networks, through guilds and early banking families? What if their esoteric spiritual practices, blending Germanic paganism, Gnostic Christianity, and possibly older mystery traditions, were preserved by initiatic societies? Modern genetics offers tantalizing but inconclusive data. Studies of Y chromosome haplogroups in European populations can track paternal lineages across centuries. The haplogroups associated with Germanic nobility, particularly R1b, are widespread across Western Europe. But pinpointing specific dynasties is nearly impossible without comparative DNA from verified Merovingian remains, and the few available samples are insufficient for definitive genealogical reconstruction. What we can say is this: aristocratic families in France, particularly in the south, maintain genealogies claiming descent from Merovingian princes. The Counts of Rennes-le-Château, for instance, appeared in documents suggesting Merovingian ancestry. During the Crusades, some French noble families carried this claim to the Holy Land, where it supposedly merged with other mystical traditions. By the medieval period, secret societies allegedly formed around the preservation of this sacred bloodline. The Priory of Sion, though its modern documents are proven forgeries, drew on older legends about Merovingian survival. Whether such organizations actually existed in medieval times remains unproven, but the legend itself reveals something important: the cultural belief that certain bloodlines carried special significance, that they had to be protected, and that they maintained hidden influence even when overt political power was lost. The Merovingian enigma represents a broader pattern. When a dynasty falls from visible power, it doesn't necessarily vanish. It disperses into the aristocratic population, its blood diluted but not eliminated. More importantly, if that dynasty cultivated specific knowledge, traditions, occult practices, financial techniques, political strategies, those could be transmitted through initiatic lineages that aren't strictly genealogical. In other words, the Merovingian bloodline might be less about literal genetics and more about a tradition of power, a set of techniques for influencing events from behind the scenes, for maintaining coherence across generations, for using religious and mystical frameworks to cement loyalty. As night deepens over the ancient Frankish heartland, we're left with questions rather than answers. Did the Merovingians truly vanish, or did they slip into the shadows, their descendants wearing different names, but remembering their origin? And if such a bloodline survived, what would it mean for our understanding of European power structures over the last 13 centuries? Perhaps the greatest secret is not whether the bloodline survived, but whether anyone still knows they're part of it and what they might do with that knowledge. Visible thrones have always drawn attention: the crown, the scepter, the public ceremonies of power. But behind every throne, in the shadows of history, other forces have shaped events: priesthoods, banking houses, military orders, and secret societies. The pattern appears across civilizations: an esoteric inner circle, bound by oaths and shared knowledge, that transcends individual rulers and survives political upheavals. These organizations often claim ancient origins, initiation rites, and preserved wisdom. Mainstream historians typically view them as social clubs for the elite, occasionally involved in politics, but fundamentally powerless. Alternative theories suggest something more: that these organizations served as vehicles for bloodline continuity and power preservation across centuries. Consider the Knights Templar. Founded in 1119 to protect Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land, the Templars rapidly evolved into something far more complex. They pioneered international banking, developed a network of fortified commanderies across Europe, answered only to the Pope, and accumulated vast wealth. For nearly 2 centuries, they operated as a sovereign military financial power, often more capable than the kingdoms they nominally served. Then, in 1307, they were suddenly suppressed. As moonlight filters through the stained glass of a medieval chapel, casting colored shadows on stone floors where knights once swore oaths, we must wonder: are the orders dead or merely dormant? Did they dissolve or simply evolve? And if powerful families needed structures to preserve their influence across centuries, what better vehicle than a secret society that claims eternal wisdom and binds its members with unbreakable vows? Through strategic marriages, they connected with the Warburgs, the Schiffs, and other banking dynasties. These families, in turn, married into European nobility and American industrial families, Vanderbilts, Morgans, Rockefellers. By the early 20th century, when you trace the genealogies of major bankers, industrialists, and political leaders in Europe and America, they formed an interlocking network connected by blood and marriage. This wasn't conspiracy. It was simply how elite society worked. Families of similar status intermarried. But the cumulative effect created what some historians call the establishment, a class of people who attended the same schools, belonged to the same clubs, married each other's children, and naturally coordinated their interests because they were quite literally family. The chessboard metaphor is apt. In chess, pieces move according to fixed rules on a defined board. But what if, in the game of history, certain families don't just play pieces, they are the board itself? What if the major institutions, central banks, intelligence agencies, multinational corporations, prestigious universities, are squares on a board controlled by families who founded them, endowed them, and continued to influence them through board memberships and strategic donations? Look at the modern world. The Bilderberg Group, an annual private conference started in 1954, brings together political leaders, corporate executives, and intellectuals. Their funding comes largely from foundations Rockefeller, Ford, Carnegie, established by industrial families. Their boards feature descendants of the same families and their close associates. We're not taught to see families as continuous entities planning across generations, or networks of families functioning as collective actors. The most striking example may be European royalty and aristocracy. After World War I toppled monarchies across Europe, casual observers assumed the old order had ended. Yet when you trace the descendants of deposed royal families, they appear in unexpected places. Corporate boards, diplomatic corps, intelligence services, philanthropic foundations. The Habsburg family, despite losing their empire in 1918, maintained vast real estate holdings and business interests. Today, descendants serve as members of the European Parliament, run cultural foundations, and maintain significant wealth. The chess metaphor extends further. In chess, sacrificing a piece to gain positional advantage is common. Perhaps some families deliberately withdrew from visible political power in the 20th century, trading crowns and presidencies for board seats and foundation control positions with less public scrutiny, but comparable influence over policy and resource allocation. As we survey this chessboard of interlocking surnames, trusts, institutions, and marriages, a question emerges. Is this just the natural tendency of elites to cluster, or is it evidence of something more deliberate? Do these families see themselves as inheritors of specific legacies, custodians of particular traditions, or is it merely inherited wealth and social capital reproducing across generations? Like water finding level, power concentrates where systems allow it to accumulate. And families, with their multi-generational timeframes and inherited advantages, are extraordinarily effective vessels for power's accumulation. The board is set, the pieces move, and the same names or their descendants continue to play. They obviously knew that traits bred true. They domesticated plants and animals through selective breeding. What if they applied the same principles to themselves, seeking to preserve or enhance characteristics they valued? Intelligence, longevity, even psychic abilities that modern science doesn't fully acknowledge? If such practices existed, and if some families maintained them across centuries through careful marriage restrictions and documentation, then the global prevalence of divine bloodline concepts might reflect not just social structure, but actual biological reality, not divine DNA, but deliberately selected human lineages that retained distinct characteristics. As dawn breaks over different horizons over Ileife and Kyoto, over Tikal and Cusco, the same question echoes across cultures. Why do humans so consistently believe that power flows through blood? Is it merely myth-making, or does it encode a deeper truth about how civilizations transmit their essence across generations? Fire rains from the sky. The earth shudders and splits. Waves taller than mountains sweep across coastal plains. Civilizations that seemed eternal cities with libraries and temples. Administrative systems and trade networks vanish in days, leaving only scattered survivors and archaeological mysteries. History records multiple such collapses. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, when nearly every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East fell within a span of decades. The fall of Rome, which took longer but still saw urban populations decline by 90% in some regions. The medieval pandemics, particularly the Black Death, which killed between a third and half of Europe's population in the 14th century. Conventional history focuses on what was lost, cities abandoned, knowledge forgotten, trade routes severed. But there's another story. Who survived and how? Cataclysms are great equalizers in some ways. Plague doesn't care about titles. Earthquakes crush palaces and hovels alike. Yet in practice, elite families have advantages that increase their survival odds. They have geographic diversity. Multiple estates mean if one region is devastated, others survive. Resource reserves, stored wealth, food, and supplies outlast initial chaos information networks. Early warning of approaching danger through trade and diplomatic contacts, mobility. Ships, horses, and social connections enabling evacuation knowledge. Literacy, maps, medical understanding, During the Bronze Age collapse, when sea peoples, possibly climate refugees, destroyed cities across the Mediterranean, some centers survived. Egypt weathered the storm, its administrative system and royal house intact. The Phoenician city-states, particularly Tyre and Sidon, not only survived, but thrived in the post-collapse period, their merchant families expanding into power vacuums left by fallen empires. Who were these survivors? Often the same elite families that had dominated before, but now with reduced competition. The collapse eliminated mid-tier kingdoms and powers, leaving a simplified landscape where the most resilient families held disproportionate influence. The Roman collapse followed a similar pattern. While the Western Empire fragmented, certain Roman aristocratic families survived by converting estates to fortified villas with private armies, converting to Christianity, and gaining church positions, marrying into Germanic royal families, relocating to Constantinople or other surviving cities. The Gregory family, for instance, produced senators and prefects during the late Empire, then bishops and popes after the collapse. Their landholdings in central Italy survived because they maintained private armed forces and negotiated with successive conquerors. 1,000 years later, the Gregorian calendar still bears their name, a minor but telling example of institutional persistence. The Black Death provides the most documented case study. When plague struck Europe in 1347 to 1353, it killed indiscriminately, but survival rates varied by social class. Wealthy families could flee to remote estates away from urban infection centers, afford better nutrition, improving immune response, isolate sick family members in separate buildings, access what little medical care existed. Contemporary chronicles note that many noble families survived intact while peasant populations were devastated. This wasn't just luck, it was the cumulative advantage of wealth and land ownership. The post-plague economy was characterized by labor shortages that increased peasant wages, but also consolidated land ownership among surviving elite families, who could acquire estates of extinct lineages at low prices. But there is a deeper pattern beyond mere survival. Elites often know disasters are coming before general populations. They have access to information merchant reports, diplomatic intelligence, scientific instruments. During the Little Ice Age, roughly 1300 to 1850, which caused famines and political instability, aristocratic families adapted by diversifying crop portfolios, investing in New World colonies for resource access, consolidating political power during crisis-driven upheaval. Alternative theories propose something more provocative, that elite families don't just survive cataclysms, but sometimes profit from them strategically. That certain collapses weren't entirely accidental, but rather occurred when ruling classes withdrew support from failing systems, allowing collapse to clear the board for reorganization on terms more favorable to them. This isn't as conspiratorial as it sounds. Consider the Bronze Age collapse. Recent research suggests that palace-centered economies had become brittle and inefficient, extracting too much from populations while providing too little. The collapse, while devastating, eventually produced more dynamic, resilient societies in the Iron Age. Did some elite families recognize the system as unsustainability and position themselves to survive and profit from the coming transition? During the fall of Rome, certain senators seem to have deliberately shifted assets from urban investments to rural estates before the worst disruptions. Did they simply have good financial instincts? Or did they understand that the empire was no longer sustainable and plan accordingly? The most unsettling possibility: that elite continuity across cataclysms isn't just about survival advantages, but about cyclical understanding. That families operating on multi-generational timeframes recognize patterns that others miss: the buildup of systemic vulnerabilities, the approach of resource crisis, the exhaustion of social contracts, and that they position themselves accordingly, not causing the collapse perhaps, but certainly not trying to prevent it if it serves their long-term interests. Imagine a patrician family in 5th century Rome, watching Gothic armies approach. They could fight to preserve the empire, or they could negotiate, offering the Goths supplies and information in exchange for guarantees that their estates will be spared. When the dust settles, the family still owns their land, now renting it to Gothic settlers. The empire has fallen, but the family endures. Multiply that scenario across collapses throughout history, and a pattern emerges. The visible structures of civilization, empires, cities, bureaucracies are ephemeral. They rise and fall in cycles of centuries. But the families, especially those with land, portable wealth, and deep knowledge, persist across these cycles. They are the continuity between ages, the living memory that spans dark periods when written records fail. As storm clouds gather over coastal waters, as seismometers detect preliminary tremors, as epidemiologists chart infection curves, we must ask, who is preparing? Who has access to information, resources, and escape routes? And when this era's cataclysms come climate change, pandemics, financial collapses, which families will emerge intact, their power renewed, ready to shape whatever civilization rises from the ruins? The blood remembers. And blood, it seems, survives. There is a story older than recorded history, whispered across cultures separated by oceans and millennia. A story of a civilization that came before advanced, powerful, and doomed. The Greeks called it Atlantis. The Hindus spoke of Kumari Kandam. The Aztecs remembered Aztlan. Across the world, flood myths and tales of lost golden ages persist with suspicious consistency. Plato's account, written around 360 BCE, describes Atlantis as a naval power that conquered much of Europe and Africa before sinking into the ocean in a single day and night of misfortune. Mainstream scholars dismissed this as allegory. Plato's philosophical thought experiment about ideal societies and their corruption. Archaeological evidence for a literal Atlantis remains non-existent, and geology doesn't support a continent vanishing in the Atlantic Ocean. Yet the myth refuses to die. And perhaps there's a reason for its persistence beyond simple human love of mystery. Consider the timeline. The last ice age ended roughly 11,700 years ago. As glaciers melted, sea levels rose dramatically in some periods, several meters per century. Coastal civilizations, if they existed, would have been inundated. Their cities now lie under hundreds of feet of ocean, beyond the reach of conventional archaeology until recently. Modern underwater archaeology has discovered surprising structures. The Yonaguni Monument off Japan, massive megalithic constructions that some argue show evidence of human shaping. Dwarka off the Indian coast, matching descriptions from Hindu texts of a city submerged by the sea. The structures near Kuba, discovered in 2001, though their artificial nature remains debated. These findings don't prove Atlantis, but they demonstrate that coastal civilizations existed in periods we previously considered prehistoric. Now consider the global distribution of megalithic architecture. From Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to 9600 BCE, to the pyramids of Egypt and Mesoamerica, from Stonehenge to Easter Island, ancient peoples constructed. Massive stone monuments requiring sophisticated astronomical knowledge, engineering capabilities, and social organization. Mainstream archaeology attributes these to independent development, each culture inventing monumental architecture separately. But alternative theorists note suspicious similarities. Precise astronomical alignments, similar construction techniques involving stones weighing hundreds of tons, shared symbolic motifs, like the serpent and the egg, and most intriguingly legends claiming these sites were built by civilizers who came from elsewhere, often from a land destroyed by catastrophe. The Atlantean hypothesis proposes this, that during the Ice Age, when sea levels were 400 feet lower, a maritime civilization existed, possibly centered on now submerged landmasses. This civilization developed advanced astronomy, navigation, agriculture, and architecture. When the Ice Age ended and seas rose, this civilization was destroyed, not in a single day as Plato wrote, but over centuries of progressive flooding. The survivors, particularly the elite, who had ships, resources, and knowledge dispersed to higher ground around the world. They settled among hunter-gatherer populations, bringing with them the seeds of civilization, agriculture, astronomy, monumental construction, and most importantly, the concept of divine kingship and bloodline preservation. This would explain why civilizations seem to appear suddenly in the archaeological record with sophisticated capabilities already in place. Sumer, for instance, appears around 4000 BCE with writing, complex irrigation, urban planning, and astronomical knowledge seemingly from nowhere. Egypt's predynastic period shows rapid development of hieroglyphics, monumental architecture, and centralized state formation. Perhaps these weren't independent inventions, but the re-emergence of knowledge carried by refugees from an older civilization. And the bloodlines? If an advanced Ice Age civilization existed, its elite families would have been those with the greatest knowledge and resources. These would be the families most likely to survive the catastrophe, to command ships and supplies, to lead migrations to new lands. Upon arrival, they would naturally become the ruling class of the societies they seeded or joined, claiming divine descent to legitimize their authority. Their knowledge of astronomy, agriculture, architecture would be carefully guarded and passed down through initiatic priesthoods. Their genetic lineage would be preserved through endogamy and strategic marriages. Over millennia, the memory of the original civilization would fade into myth stories of Atlantis, of gods descending from the sky or emerging from the sea, of a golden age before the flood. Is there any evidence for this beyond pattern matching and speculation? Genetic studies show that human migrations during the post-Ice Age period were complex and involved some populations with unusual ancestry profiles. The Clovis people of North America, for instance, appear suddenly around 13,000 years ago with sophisticated stone technology, and their genetic origins remain debated. The Austronesian expansion across the Pacific demonstrated that ancient peoples had far greater maritime capabilities than once believed. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that a comet or asteroid impact around 10,800 BCE caused rapid climate changes, megafaunal extinctions, and possibly the destruction of an advanced culture. While controversial, geological evidence of widespread fire and climate disruption during this period continues to accumulate. Could this have been the cataclysm that destroyed Atlantis? Could the survivors have been the culture bearers who taught agriculture to hunter-gatherers in the Fertile Crescent, who designed the first temples at Göbekli Tepe, who brought the concept of divine kingship to Egypt and Sumer? And if such a diaspora occurred, would the elite families from that lost civilization maintain their identity? Would they remember, across the dark millennia, who they were and where they came from? Would they encode that memory in myths, in symbols, in bloodline preservation? The most provocative version of this hypothesis suggests that certain families today, those claiming the most ancient pedigrees, those involved in esoteric societies preserving ancient wisdom, are the direct descendants of Atlantean elite. That the blood of that lost civilization flows, diluted but unbroken, through royal houses and secret dynasties. That their multi-millennial perspective on power comes from an unbroken tradition extending back before the pyramids, before Sumer, before recorded history began. Is this true? Almost certainly not in its most literal form. But perhaps there is a kernel of truth. That catastrophic climate change at the end of the Ice Age did destroy coastal civilizations. That survivors with advanced knowledge did seed later cultures. That some families preserved the memory of this origin and built their identity around it. In 1139, during the papal schism that tore medieval Christendom apart, an Irish bishop named Malachi traveled to Rome. According to legend, while there he experienced a vision, a complete list of all future popes, from his contemporary Celestine II to the final pope who would preside over the end of the Church and the Last Judgment. This document, the Prophecy of the Popes, consists of 112 short Latin phrases, each supposedly describing a future pontiff. The list was allegedly hidden in Vatican archives and only rediscovered and published in 1595 by Benedictine monk Arnold de Wien. Mainstream scholars consider it a forgery, probably created around 1590, with prophecies for popes before that date simply describing known history, while predictions for subsequent popes are vague enough to fit anyone. The timing of its discovery, during the papal conclave of 1590, when multiple candidates jockeyed for position, suggests it was a propaganda tool. Yet what makes the prophecy persistently interesting isn't whether it's genuinely prophetic, but the pattern it reveals about how certain families rose to the papacy and how often those families connect to older bloodlines. Take a few examples from the guardian son, de Labor Solis, matched to John Paul II, 1978 to 2005, who was born on the day of a solar eclipse and buried on the day of another. But John Paul II was Karol Wojtyła, from Polish nobility with genealogical connections to Lithuanian princely families that traced lineage to medieval kingdoms. Gloria of the Olive, Gloria Olivae, matched to Benedict XVI, 2005 to 2013, who chose the Benedictine order symbol. Joseph Ratzinger came from Bavarian background, a region where certain families maintained records back to the Holy Roman Empire's early period. Peter the Roman, the final prophecy, supposedly referring to the last pope during tribulation. Some have controversially applied this to Francis, 2013 present, born Jorge Mario Bergoglio. The Bergoglio family came from Italian Piedmont before emigrating to Argentina. Piedmont aristocracy has deep connections to medieval Italian nobility. The pattern isn't about the prophecy's accuracy, it's about who becomes pope. Despite the Church's theoretical openness to any ordained male Catholic, the papacy has consistently drawn from families with significant social status. Even in the modern era, when popes often come from humble backgrounds publicly, their extended family trees frequently show connections to regional nobility, wealthy merchant families, or old clerical dynasties. In earlier centuries, this was explicit. The Renaissance papacy was dominated by a handful of families, Borgia, Medici, Dalla Rovere, Farnese, who traded the position back and forth like a dynasty. These families were interconnected through marriage and alliance. The papal throne was, effectively, hereditary within a closed class, even though individual popes couldn't pass it to their sons, though they often tried through nephews, creating the term nepotism. What if documents like the prophecy of the popes weren't predictions, but plans? What if they encoded which families would be next in line for power? Agreements made between dynasties about future succession. The vague Latin phrases could be codes recognizable to insiders, but obscure to outsiders. This sounds conspiratorial, but consider how institutions actually work. Power doesn't randomly distribute. It flows through networks, families, schools, patronage systems. When cardinals gather to elect a pope, they don't choose randomly. They negotiate, form coalitions, honor old debts, and consider which families are owed the position. If such negotiations occurred in 1590 or 1139 or any period, they might well be encoded in cryptic documents that serve both as reminders to insiders and as mystical propaganda to outsiders who would see prophecy rather than political planning. The deeper question: why do certain families appear repeatedly in papal history? Is it merely that Catholics from prominent families are more likely to rise through church hierarchy? Or is there something more a sense among certain lineages that the papacy is their birthright, their family's role in a multi-generational plan? Some of these families, claim descent from Roman patricians who converted to Christianity and whose descendants became the church as aristocracy. Others connect to Carolingian or Merovingian nobility. A few have genealogies suggesting connections to ancient Mediterranean elites, Phoenician merchant dynasties, Greek philosophical schools, Egyptian Coptic communities. If we accept that elite families plan across generations and maintain identity across centuries, then controlling the papacy, which for 1,000 years was Europe's most powerful institution, would be a logical objective. Multiple families competing for it might reach accommodations. Your family in this century, ours in the next. Such agreements, encoded cryptically, might look very much like prophecy to outsiders. The prophecy of the popes, whether genuine medieval vision or Renaissance forgery, ultimately reveals a truth about power. It doesn't surprise those inside the system. They know who's next, who's being groomed, which families are due for elevation. To them, the future isn't mystery, it's plan. As candlelight flickers across ancient manuscripts in Vatican archives, casting shadows on words written centuries ago, we must ask, how many documents in those archives are what they appear to be? How many prophecies are actually memoranda? How many miracles were careful orchestration? And how many families still treat the church, the state, and other institutions not as impersonal organizations, but as family property to be managed across generations? The list continues. The prophecies unfold or are fulfilled by those who know what's written and ensure it comes to pass. And the blood flows on, from one century to the next, wearing different vestments, but always, somehow, holding the keys. Fast forward through centuries. The age of absolute monarchs gives way to constitutional governments. Revolutions proclaim equality. Republics replace kingdoms. Democracy spreads. The modern world, we're told, is a meritocracy where anyone can rise based on talent and effort. Yet when we examine who actually holds power, not ceremonial positions, but real influence over finance, policy, and global institutions, certain names appear with suspicious frequency. Names that, when traced backward, connect to medieval nobility, to Renaissance banking families, to the same bloodlines we've been following. This isn't hidden. It's in public records, corporate filings, foundation boards, diplomatic postings. But we rarely connect the dots because we think of power in terms of individuals and offices, not families and centuries. Consider banking. The Rothschilds, who began with Meyer Amschel Rothschild in 18th century Frankfurt, built an international banking empire through his 5 sons establishing branches in major European capitals. Today, various branches of the family remain involved in banking, private equity, and wine production. Their wealth is estimated in billions, though the family's private nature makes precise figures impossible. Trace the Rothschild genealogy backward. Meyer Amschel's ancestors were Frankfurt goldsmiths and traders. Before that, the trail becomes murky, but the family evidently had established commercial and rabbinical connections, suggesting they were part of the Jewish mercantile elite that had existed in Europe since Roman times. Some genealogists claim connections to Sephardic families expelled from Spain in 1492, who in turn traced lineage to medieval Jewish merchants who worked with both Christian and Muslim rulers. If we accept these lineages, the Rothschilds represent an unbroken tradition of financial expertise stretching back perhaps 1,000 years, a family that survived expulsions, pogroms, and revolutions by maintaining economic indispensability. The same pattern appears elsewhere. The Warburg family, rising to prominence in 16th century Hamburg, eventually spreading to England and America. Paul Warburg was instrumental in creating the Federal Reserve in 1913. Today, family members remain active in banking, philanthropy, and academia. Backward genealogy suggests connections to Venetian and German Jewish trading networks in the medieval period. Among British aristocracy, the Spencer family, which produced Princess Diana, traces documented lineage to the 15th century, with claims of earlier descent from medieval nobility. The Churchill family, of which Winston Churchill was a member, connects to the Dukes of Marlborough, with lineage to the 12th century. When you map the intermarriages of British peerage, virtually all connect to William the Conqueror's companions, a genetic bottleneck almost 1,000 years old. In America, supposedly the land of self-made men, both Bush presidents descend from British aristocracy. The Pierce family, which held lands since the 13th century. The Roosevelt family, both Theodore and Franklin branches, descend from 17th century Dutch settlers who were themselves from merchant families with medieval trading connections. John Kerry's family, despite the Irish-sounding name, includes Jewish financiers. His paternal grandparents were Austrian Jews named Kohn, and Massachusetts Brahmins on his mother's side, interconnecting two elite networks. Moving to Europe, the Habsburg family, despite losing political power in 1918, retained enormous wealth through real estate, forestry, and investments. Karl von Habsburg, current head of the house, served as a member of the European Parliament. The family maintains foundations and cultural organizations across Europe. Their genealogy goes back, with reasonable documentation, to the 10th century, 1,000 years of continuous family identity. French nobility, despite the Revolution's guillotines. Many families survived or returned after Napoleon. Today, descendants of pre-revolutionary aristocracy appear disproportionately in business, diplomacy, and elite institutions. The Rothschild connection in France exemplifies this: a Jewish banking family that, through marriage alliances and financial services, integrated with surviving Catholic aristocracy, creating a hybrid elite. In Italy, families like the Colonna have maintained continuity since the 12th century. Today, while they no longer have political power, they own significant real estate, manage cultural foundations, and maintain social connections throughout European high society. The pattern repeats across the Italian nobility families that produced. Renaissance popes and condottieri now sit on corporate boards and heritage commissions. The most intriguing connections appear when mapping global institutions. Look at the Bilderberg Group, the Trilateral Commission, the Council on Foreign Relations Organizations, dismissed as conspiracy theory fodder, but which actually exist and whose membership is public record. Their participants include political leaders from major powers, CEOs of multinational corporations, central bank governors, media executives. Selective intellectuals and academics now trace the genealogies of long-term participants and their families. Not all, certainly many are genuine meritocratic achievers from middle-class backgrounds, but a substantial minority connect to old aristocratic or merchant families. And those families often intermarry, their children attending the same elite schools, Eton, Groton, La Rosey, joining the same clubs, entering the same professions. Is this conspiracy? Not exactly. It's network effects compounded over generations. If your family has wealth, you attend elite schools. There you befriend others from similar backgrounds. You marry someone from your social class. Your children repeat the pattern. Over centuries, this creates an interconnected class that, while not coordinating every action, shares interests, worldviews, and importantly, access to each other. The alternative hypothesis suggests something more, that certain families consciously maintain their identity across generations, that they see themselves as inheritors of specific traditions. Roman Egyptian, Babylonian Atlantean, whatever origin myth they prefer, and that this identity motivates their children to seek power not for personal gain, but to fulfill family destiny. Whether this consciousness exists is almost irrelevant. The structural effect is the same. Certain families maintain proximity to power across centuries through mechanisms that don't require conscious conspiracy, inherited wealth, network effects, cultural capital, and the simple fact that people prefer to work with, marry, and trust those similar to themselves. The modern names we see in banking and government and global organizations cast ancient shadows when we trace them backward. Not every powerful person today comes from old bloodlines, but enough do that the pattern is unmistakable. The game of power has more continuity than disruption. The players change, but many are descendants of the players from centuries past. As morning sun illuminates the glass towers of global finance, casting reflections across steel and stone, we see modern power in its contemporary form. But the foundations beneath those towers, the networks that built them, the families whose capital and connections made them possible, those roots reach deeper into soil tilled by ancestors whose names we've forgotten, but whose blood still flows. In Germany and Austria, the nobility lost titles but kept wealth. Some supported Hitler, seeing him as preferable to communism. Others opposed him. The skills required to run a modern state economic management, diplomacy, law remained valuable regardless of ideology. Families that had served the Sultan simply served the Republic. The world wars themselves, catastrophic as they were, didn't fundamentally alter who held wealth and connection. Yes, some families lost sons and fortunes, but the institutions that survived, banks, corporations, intelligence services, were often run by the same families or their networks. The post-war order was negotiated by elites who had connections across the former enemy lines bankers who had worked together before the war, aristocrats who were related by marriage despite their nations fighting. Decolonization after World War II provides another case study. European powers granted independence to colonies across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. New nations emerged with new leaders, ending centuries of colonial rule. Yet examine the economic structures. Former colonies remained tied to their colonial metropoles through trade, debt, and corporate ownership. British firms continued to extract resources from former colonies. French companies retained dominant positions in Francophone Africa. We stand now at the end of a journey through millennia. We've walked through Egyptian temples and Babylonian ziggurats, through medieval courts and Renaissance banking halls, through revolutions and catastrophes, following a thread of blood and power that seems never quite to break. What have we found? Not proof is for mathematics and courts of law. Not certainty history is too complex, too fragmentary, too manipulated by victors and propagandists to offer certainty about such subtle patterns. What we've found is possibility. A possibility that power is far more continuous than our myths of progress and revolution suggest. That certain families, through combination of genetic inheritance, accumulated wealth, institutional knowledge, and multi-generational planning, maintain influence across time scales that dwarf individual lives. Whether these families consciously understand themselves as ancient bloodlines, descendants of Egyptian priests, Mesopotamian kings, Atlantean survivors, is almost beside the point. The structural advantages alone would be sufficient. Start with wealth, maintain it through careful financial management and strategic marriages. Invest in your children's education and connections. Repeat for 20 or 30 generations. The compound interest of advantage is staggering. Add to this the possibility, just the possibility, that some families do maintain conscious identity across centuries, that they preserve traditions, knowledge, and purposes that transcend any single generation's understanding, that they view nations and ideologies as ephemeral, while their family is eternal. If such families exist, they would naturally gravitate toward institutions and positions that offer long-term influence. Banking, which outlasts governments, religious hierarchies, which outlast kingdoms, secret societies, which maintain continuity across political changes, and multinational corporations, which transcend national boundaries. The evidence we've examined suggests this pattern exists, whether by design or by natural selection of families skilled at survival. The genetic studies showing elite populations maintaining distinct lineages across centuries. The genealogical records connecting modern powerful families to medieval and ancient ones. The repeated appearance of certain surnames and networks in positions of influence across time. The survival of families through catastrophes that destroyed nations. The persistent myths across cultures of special bloodlines with divine or supernatural origins. But there's another reflection in this mirror, one that forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. If ancient bloodlines do still influence the world, is that necessarily sinister? Might there be value in institutions guided by families with centuries of perspective, who think beyond quarterly profits and election cycles? When environmental collapse threatens civilization, when short-term thinking has created crisis after crisis, might we actually benefit from leadership with longer time horizons? The counter-argument is equally powerful. If power is indeed hereditary, maintained by families across centuries through mechanisms that exclude outsiders, then our democratic pretenses are hollow. The social mobility we celebrate is largely illusion. The meritocracy we believe in is a story told to justify outcomes predetermined by birth. And the revolutions we thought changed everything merely replaced one set of elite families with another, or allowed the same families to persist under new names. Which interpretation is closer to truth? Probably both contain elements of reality. The world is too large, too complex, too chaotic for any group to fully control. Genuine social mobility exists. Some families rise from nothing. Some old families decline into obscurity. Technology and economic change create genuine disruptions that reshuffle power. But beneath this churning surface, networks of old wealth and connection provide ballast, not determining every outcome, but influencing enough outcomes to perpetuate themselves, creating a world where power, while not entirely hereditary, is much more hereditary than we like to admit. As we conclude, we return to where we began, that dusty chamber, that candlelit space where the past presses close. What question do we carry forward? Perhaps it's this. In our own lives, in our own moment, whose game are we playing? When we vote, work, consume, invest, are we exercising genuine choice, or are we moving along paths laid down long ago by families whose names we don't even know? When we look at the leaders presented to us, the choices offered, the range of acceptable discourse, who set those boundaries and why? Or perhaps the question is more personal. What does it mean to build something lasting? These families, if our hypothesis is correct, succeeded in creating continuity across time. They bound their descendants to purposes larger than individual happiness. They sacrificed present comfort for future legacy. Is that admirable or horrifying? Would we want to be part of such a lineage? Our lives shaped by ancestors dead 1,000 years and obligations to descendants not yet born? And finally, what secrets remain hidden? If bloodline and power have persisted across millennia, what knowledge have they accumulated? What understanding of human nature, of social control, of cosmic cycles? If ancient priesthoods really did preserve advanced knowledge through dark ages, if secret societies genuinely maintain initiatic traditions from lost civilizations, what might they know that the rest of us don't? Not supernatural powers, those likely don't exist, but perhaps subtle things, psychological techniques for maintaining family loyalty across generations, economic strategies for surviving market crashes, methods for influencing institutions without holding visible office, ways of reading historical patterns that allow long-term prediction. These would be powerful enough if mastered and hoarded across centuries. As dawn breaks over ancient ruins and modern citadels alike, we're left with uncertainty, which is perhaps appropriate. The deepest truths about power rarely appear in textbooks or news reports. They're lived quietly, passed from parent to child in private, maintained through networks that leave few records. But we can observe the patterns. We can note who holds power, who their parents and grandparents were, who their children marry, where they invest, which institutions they build and support. We can ask questions about why power flows as it does, why some families persist across centuries while others vanish. And if we pay attention, if we look beyond the surface drama of politics and markets to the deeper currents of wealth and lineage, we might glimpse something profound. That human history is not primarily a story of ideas or technologies or great individuals. It's a story of families, some brief as mayflies, others enduring as mountain ranges. And the families that learned to endure, that perfected the art of continuity across catastrophe and transformation, those families shaped the world we inhabit. Whether they still shape it today, whether their blood still matters, whether ancient lineages guide modern events, these questions we leave with you. Not because we lack opinions, but because the deepest questions don't have simple answers. They require each person to examine the evidence, to weigh possibilities, to decide what patterns they see in the mirror of history. The blood that remembers flows on. The families that survived 1,000 years past will likely survive 1,000 years future, adapting as they always have, wearing new masks while maintaining old purposes. And we, whoever we are, descended from our own forgotten lines, carrying our own genetic memories, we are part of this great tapestry, even if we don't know the full pattern. Perhaps that's the final insight. We are all bloodlines. Some trace theirs to pharaohs, others to farmers. But every human alive descends from survivors, people who endured ice ages and plagues, wars and famines, catastrophes beyond counting. The blood of those survivors flows in us. Their memories, encoded in genetics and culture, shape us. The difference is, some families remember who they are. They maintain the story across generations. They plan accordingly. Others forget, losing their past in the churn of history, becoming modern individuals disconnected from deep time. Which are you? Which would you want to be? And in the world ahead, as old orders strain and new crises emerge, which type of family will shape what comes next? These questions linger as the sun rises over a world both ancient and new. The same families, perhaps, watching the same dawn from their estates and penthouses. The same blood, flowing through different ages. The same game, played with new pieces. Whether you believe the thesis we've explored or dismiss it as pattern-seeking and randomness, one thing remains undeniable. Power concentrates, wealth compounds, connections persist. And families, more than individuals, are the vessels in which these forces accumulate across time. The documentary ends, but the story continues. Somewhere, in a quiet room, parents tell their children about who they are, where they came from, what responsibilities they bear. Somewhere, a marriage is arranged between families with complementary assets and compatible lineages. Somewhere, a meeting convenes of people who share no common employer or nationality, but who understand each other perfectly, bound by networks older than nations. The blood remembers. The question is, what else does it know?